Hey, Legacy Church. It's great to be back together again with you this week. I hope you've had a great week. We've been praying for you and thinking about you, and we're excited to see what God has to teach us this week through our David series. You know, when my daughter Sparrow was born, I knew that I was in trouble because this little creature had now been born who already owned me, right? I knew in that moment that no matter what she did, I would have no other choice but to love her. And ever since that moment, it's been this constant battle between showing her that love, but also not spoiling her. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that even after they hurt you, you know you can't stop loving them? Maybe it was a child or a parent or a spouse, or maybe it was just someone you poured your life into, someone you prayed for or sacrificed for or believed in. And then somewhere along the line, the relationship becomes more complicated. Maybe they walked away, maybe they turned against you, maybe they made choices that brought pain into their own life and into yours. And even though a part of you was angry or maybe even brokenhearted, there was still another part of you that loved them. Strange, right? I mean, you would think that in the moments of deep pain, those feelings of love would dissolve. It would just kind of fade away. But sometimes they just don't. Because our love for someone doesn't always disappear when a relationship becomes painful. Oftentimes, love is exactly what makes the pain so deep. You know, there's an old principle in relationship counseling that's sometimes described as the love-hate continuum. Have you heard of it? The idea behind it is that the more deeply you love someone, the more deeply they can hurt you. For example, a stranger could say something to you and it might hurt. But when someone you love rejects you, it reaches a completely different place because the wound isn't just about what they did, it's about who did it. And I think that's one of the things that makes family pain so difficult. See, family is supposed to be the safe place, the place where we're known and where we're loved and where people stay. But many of us know that families can also become places of disappointment and division and resentment and silence and grief. And oftentimes the people that we love are also the people who have the greatest ability to hurt us, which is exactly where we find David in the next chapter of his story. See, for the last 6 weeks, we've been looking at the heart of David from the field to the palace. We've watched as he's risen to power and developed into a man after God's own heart. But we know it wasn't all perfect though, right? Last week, we saw him in one of the darkest moments of his life. David used his power to take Bathsheba. He arranged for Uriah to die. He hid what he had done. But when Nathan confronted him, David repented, and God forgave him. But David soon discovered that receiving God's forgiveness doesn't mean that every earthly consequence disappears. See, Nathan told David that the sword would not depart from his house. And from that point forward, David's family began to fall apart. Now, I think the same is true for us. See, God can forgive us completely, and yet the choices we make can leave scars that last a lifetime. And when we come to 2 Samuel 15, David is in the midst of living in this pain. Absalom, his son, has turned against him, not just privately, but publicly, politically, militarily. He's trying to usurp his father's throne. And what makes this story so difficult is that David isn't just dealing with rebellion, he's dealing with his son. And so the question that I've been wrestling with all week is, what does faithfulness look like when the people we love become a part of our deeper pain? In 2 Samuel 15, verse 1, the author writes this: "In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with the chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. And whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him. 'What town are you from?' he would answer. 'Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel.' Then Absalom would say to him, 'Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you.' And Absalom would add, 'If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case could come to me, and I would see that they would receive justice.' Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take a hold of him, and kiss him. In other words, get up off of your knees. I'm just like you. I'm a regular guy." Absalom behaved in this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. And so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. All right, so we see Absalom begin to build an image. He's got a chariot, horses, 50 men running ahead of him. In a sense, Absalom wanted the people to see him coming and think, that looks like a king. And then he positions himself at the city gate. See, the city gate was one of those primary places where legal disputes were heard and public business was conducted. In fact, at the ancient city of Dan in northern Israel, you can still see a 2,900-year-old stone judgment platform at the entrance of the city. It's called the Kisei Din, which means seat of judgment. And so as people came looking for justice, Absalom would intercept them before they reached David and began rendering judgments. And what did he do? Well, he told them exactly what they wanted to hear. He said, "You're right. Your case is valid. You deserve justice. If only I were in charge, then someone would finally listen to you." You see what he's doing? He isn't actually solving their problems. He's using their frustration. He's telling people that the system is broken, the king doesn't care, and he's the only person who can make it right. And slowly, over time, people begin to believe him. The author of 2 Samuel describes it like this. He says that Absalom stole the hearts of the people, which I think is an interesting phrase, right? He didn't earn the hearts. He stole them. He used charm and flattery and appearance, all in an attempt to undermine his father's authority. In other words, Absalom's rebellion didn't begin on the battlefield. It began with conversations, little criticisms, carefully planted suspicions. And eventually, Absalom sends word throughout Israel that he, in fact, has now become king. Now, we have to be honest about something here. David wasn't a perfect father. In fact, he made some serious mistakes, right? Early in the story, one of David's other sons, Amnon, sexually assaulted Absalom's sister Tamar. And when he found out, David became furious, but he didn't act. He didn't bring justice. He didn't protect Tamar. He didn't hold Amnon accountable. And because of this, Absalom carried the anger for years. In fact, eventually Absalom murdered Amnon and fled. And even after he returns to Jerusalem, David keeps him at a distance for 2 years. They were in the same city, but David refused to see him. And so when we come to this rebellion, Absalom's actions are wrong. But we have to recognize that his family situation is complicated. There's been failure and injustice and unresolved pain. And I think that matters because family problems rarely come out of nowhere. There's usually a history of hurt behind the dysfunction. And maybe that looks like a conversation that never happened or a pattern that everyone learned to live around. And eventually what has been buried comes to light. So here's the first lesson. You can be a person after God's own heart and still have a deeply complicated family dynamic. I think sometimes we imagine that if we're faithful enough or wise enough or spiritual enough, that our families should turn out perfect, that our children will make good decisions, our marriages will never struggle, that everyone will stay close, that nobody will become resentful. And when that doesn't happen, we assume that it must mean we've completely failed. But David's story, it won't allow us to believe that. See, David loved God. He worshiped, he prayed, he repented. And yet David's family was still a mess. Now, that doesn't mean David didn't have responsibility. He obviously did. But the story also reminds us that every person in a family has a will of their own. You can love someone and still have no control over them. Now, that's not an excuse for bad leadership in our families, but it is an invitation to grace, to humility. Because healthy families aren't built by pretending everything's perfect. They're built by people who are willing to tell the truth. Every family has complexity, and the sooner that we realize that, the sooner we can experience God's peace in the midst of our pain. So here's the truth. You can be loved by God, used by God, and genuinely faithful to God, and still find yourself standing in the midst of a giant family mess. Which brings us to our second point, and that's this. Sometimes the most gracious thing God can do is let us live with the consequences of our sin. Notice how at the beginning of our story, David was forgiven by his sin, but the consequences for his sin don't disappear. Sometimes we assume that if God forgives us, every consequence should immediately disappear. Shouldn't he just take it all away? But that's not usually how grace works. Sometimes grace doesn't remove the consequences. It just gives us the strength to walk through them. And And there are a few reasons I think God allows that to happen. First is that consequences remind us that sin is destructive. If you don't think you need this reminder, just think what your life would look like if there were no consequences for your sin. We'd be like the children in Pinocchio who go to Pleasure Island, thinking that the ultimate expression of our happiness is the unfiltered, endless pursuit of pleasure. But God knows that this type of life is hollow and ends in our destruction. And so sometimes he allows us to experience the consequences of our sin so that we remember that sin doesn't want to please us. It wants to devour us. Second, consequences produce humility. They remind us that we aren't in fact in control, and they teach us to depend on God in a deeper way. Third, consequences keep us depending on God. See, David couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't repair every wound. He had to keep returning to God's mercy. Now, hear me carefully. I'm not saying that the consequences of our sin are good, and I'm not saying God delights in our pain. All I'm saying is that God is so gracious that even the painful consequences of our failure aren't beyond his ability to redeem. God may not remove every consequence, but he will never waste one. He can use it to produce humility and wisdom and compassion and a deeper dependence on him. Because ultimately, consequences aren't condemnation. They're opportunities to grow in God. See, David was still forgiven, but he was also living with the earthly fallout of his choices. And so Absalom declared himself king, and the conspiracy grew. And a messenger comes to David and says that the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. And David realizes that he has to leave Jerusalem. And so in verse 13, he says, a messenger came and told David that the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. Then David said to all of his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring us to ruin and put the city to the sword. All right, can you imagine this moment for a second? David is fleeing Jerusalem. He's fought for Israel. He's built a kingdom. And now he's leaving the city because his own son is coming to take it from him. The first time that David ran, he ran from Saul. And now he's the king, and he's running from Absalom. The whole story's turned upside down. But even in this moment, there's something important for us to learn about how David responds. See, he doesn't immediately fight to preserve his image or burn Jerusalem on the way out. He doesn't sacrifice the city just to hold on to power. He actually leaves because he doesn't want Jerusalem destroyed. See, David has made serious mistakes, but now in this moment, he's thinking like a shepherd again. He's willing to lose the palace to protect the people. And then Zadok and the Levites arrive carrying the ark, which you'd think would be a good thing. After all, it represents the presence of God. Maybe he could use it as proof that God was still on his side. But in verse 25, David says, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and my dwelling place again. But if he says, I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Which is this amazing moment of humility when you think about it, right? David doesn't use God's presence as a political prop. He basically says, take it back to Jerusalem, and if God is still on my side, then he will show me mercy. I think that's humility, right? David isn't pretending to be innocent. He knows some of this pain is connected to his past, but he also doesn't give up on God. He doesn't say, because I failed, God has abandoned me forever. He submits himself to the mercy and judgment of God, which brings us to the third lesson, and that's this. Faith begins where control ends. David can't control Absalom. He can't control the people. He can't control whether he'll return to Jerusalem. And that must have felt foreign to a man like David, a man who had become accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. And yet here he is finding himself out of control. He's in control of virtually nothing, which is such a hard place to live in when you think about it. I mean, we love to be in control, don't we? Most of the time we trust in God, we're fine trusting in God as long as he agrees with our plans. Most of us don't realize how much we're depending on control until God asks us to let go of it. But there are these moments when no strategy can fix what's happening. You can't force a child to come home. You can't force someone to forgive you. You can't force a family member to get help. And that's exactly where David finds himself. And now all that he can do is trust God. I mean, that's what faith sounds like, right? David isn't giving up, he's giving over. See, giving up is hopeless, but giving over, that's hopeful. David still takes wise action. He leaves the city, he organizes his people, he listens to counsel, he prays, but he refuses to pretend that he's God. And that's where his true power really begins. Have you ever tried to play God in your life? It's an exhausting burden to bear, isn't it? We think if we say the perfect thing or do the perfect thing or pray the perfect prayer, then we can, guarantee the outcome. But that's not how it works. Sometimes in life, the outcome is simply out of our control. And the sooner that we can turn it over to God, the sooner we can experience the blessings that come from that. And so in our story, David turns and he leaves Jerusalem. And in verse 30, it says, "But David continued up to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot, and all the people with him covered their heads, their head tops, and were weeping as they went up." I mean, what a strong picture of grief, right? David isn't walking out with confidence. He's weeping. He's barefoot. His head is covered. I mean, essentially, he's humiliated. He's brokenhearted, which is just so real of him, isn't it? David doesn't hide his grief. He doesn't pretend that that's what faith means, that he's unaffected. He doesn't stand in front of everyone and say, I'm blessed and highly favored, that everything's amazing. No, right? He weeps. He cries. He walks up the Mount of Olives in sorrow. And the people, they weep with him. There are times when faith is going to look like courage in the valley. There are other times when it looks like dancing before the Lord. But then there are times when it looks like walking uphill and weeping. Still moving, still praying, still trusting, but broken in grief. Some of us have been taught to treat grief like a spiritual failure. We think strong Christians should recover quickly. But grief isn't unbelief. After all, Jesus wept, and David weeps. Faith doesn't mean the absence of sorrow or pain or suffering. It's our response to sorrow and pain and suffering. And so David must decide now what he'll do next. And so while he's walking, he receives word that Ahithophel, one of his trusted advisors, has now joined Absalom. And so he prays, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's heart and wisdom into foolishness," which is such a great prayer, right? There's no frills, no curses. He basically just prays that God would force him to give bad advice to Absalom. Which brings us to the fourth lesson, and that's God's grace is sufficient even when our family story is painful and unfinished. See, David's world is falling apart, but he's still praying. Grace doesn't always mean that God instantly repairs the relationship. Grace sometimes means that God gives us enough strength to take the next step and enough hope to believe that the story isn't over, even when it doesn't end the way we wanted. See, the battle eventually comes. David organizes his army, but he doesn't go with them. And before he leaves, he gives one clear command. He says, "The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." I love that phrase. What a tender thing to say, right? I mean, can you hear the father in him? He's going up against his son, who's embarrassed and humiliated him. He's going to war with him. And yet he still says, be gentle with this young man. Not the traitor, not the rebel, not the enemy, the young man. Absalom may see David as an obstacle, but David still sees Absalom as his son. David refuses to let the bitterness erase the fact that Absalom is still one of his. And that's one of the things that's hardest we have to face when we reconcile with family pain. How do we hold truth and love at the same time? How do we establish a boundary without losing compassion? See, David resists the rebellion, but his heart still says, be gentle with this young man. Unfortunately, Joab doesn't obey, and during the battle, Absalom's hair becomes caught in the branches of a large oak tree, and he's left hanging while the mule he's riding continues on. And when Joab hears that this has happened, he takes advantage and he pulls out 3 javelins and he stabs Absalom to death. And from a political perspective, this is a victory. But when the messenger arrives and tells David what has happened, he asks only one question: is the young man Absalom safe? But he tells them that he's been killed. And in verse 33, the author writes, the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. And as he wept, he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, my son." I mean, can you imagine that? David doesn't say the rebellion's over. He's not happy about his victory. The only thing he can say is, my son, if only I had died instead of you. David would have rather taken Absalom's place than have him die, which actually points us to the most important teaching moment in this whole story, which is what David can't do. See, as much as he wishes he could, David cannot take Absalom's place. He wants to, but he can't. Absalom is gone, and David can't reverse what's happened. He can't repair every failure. He can't save his son, no matter how badly he wants to, no matter how hard he tries. His son is gone. But here's the thing. There is another king who would eventually come later, actually in the line of David. And this king is going to have the power to do exactly what David cannot. See, in that moment, when his son dies, the king doesn't have the power to save him. But now we have a king who looked at the rebellious sons and daughters of his and did more than just say, if only I could take your spot. See, Jesus does exactly that. He takes our place so that our rebellion and sin can be forgiven and we can be restored. Romans 5 says that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Not after we fixed ourselves, not after we came home, not after we proved our loyalty, while we were yet sinners in rebellion. See, David, he climbed the Mount of Olives. Jesus did too. David went up weeping as he fled Jerusalem. Jesus went up knowing that he would be betrayed, arrested, and crucified. David left Jerusalem to save the city from destruction, but Jesus returned to Jerusalem to save the city from destruction. David cried, if only I had died instead of you. But Jesus said, I did. See, that's the gospel. That while we were in rebellion, our God died for us so that we might live. So what do we do with this story? Well, first we need to remember that you can be a person after God's own heart and still have a deeply complicated family dynamic. That means we lead our families with humility, not perfection, humility. Second, we need to remember that sometimes the most gracious thing God can do is let us live with the consequences of our sin. If you're still carrying scars from your past, don't confuse consequences with condemnation. God may not remove every consequence, but he'll never waste one. Third, faith begins where control ends. We can pray, love, speak truth, set boundaries, offer help, but we can't become the Holy Spirit in someone else's life. At some point, we have to place them in God's hands. We have to trust that God's going to care for them. And fourth, God's grace is sufficient even when our family story is painful and unfinished. And if that's your story, you don't have to pretend that it doesn't hurt. You can weep and still trust God. Your family history might explain a part of your story, but it doesn't have to determine your future. Cycles can be broken. Forgiveness can grow. And even where full restoration isn't possible, God can still bring healing. You know, some of us are carrying the name of an Absalom in our heart. Someone we love, someone we worry about, someone who's hurt us, someone whose choices we can't control. And maybe we've spent so much time trying to fix them that we've forgotten how to surrender them. Or maybe the pain has hardened into anger and we've stopped praying for them. Or maybe we're blaming ourselves for every choice that they make. And if that's the case, today I believe that God is inviting us to bring that person and that pain back into his presence. Not because everything will become easy, not because every relationship will be restored exactly the way we want, but because God's grace is enough and it remains sufficient even in the mess. See, David was a man after God's own heart, and his family was deeply broken. And these two truths existed at the same time, which means that your family's pain doesn't disqualify you from God's love, that your past mistakes don't place you beyond God's mercy. They may still leave consequences, but consequences are not the same as condemnation. And your inability to control someone else doesn't mean you've failed. God is still present, still working, still forgiving, still healing, and still loving rebellious sons and daughters enough to bring them home. Because David said, if I only had died instead of you. But Jesus actually did. And though his death or through his death and resurrection, every person who turns towards him can become a part of a new family, the family of God. A family built not on perfection, but on grace. Amen? All right. Thanks, Legacy Church. We love you. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next week.